Yes, my name is Daniel Horan, and I'm Professor of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I am delighted to welcome you to this lecture, but before introducing our guest, I want to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 with the generous support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and we have many joining us here live in person, and I think some virtually as well. Under the vision of Dr. Keith Egan, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish here at St. Mary's to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, as well as the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize these Native peoples and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. The format for our program this afternoon is twofold. First, Dr. Wheeler will present her lecture, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments from both the in-person and virtual audience. So for those joining us via live stream, we invite you to submit your comments and questions throughout the lecture using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you in the room, I'll be walking around with a microphone. Just wave me down. I also want to acknowledge that we have our bookstore present with us, and we're grateful to Amelia, the director of the bookstore, and the team there for providing an opportunity to purchase Dr. Wheeler's book, An Introduction to Ecospirituality. So if you like what you hear today, and even if you don't like what you hear today, still buy her book. And for our friends joining us virtually, you'll see a link now in the chat for Dr. Wheeler's book through Fortress Press, its publisher. And now it's my privilege to introduce our guest today. Dr. Rachel Wheeler is Associate Professor of Spirituality and Chair of the Theology Department at the University of Portland, where she teaches biblical spirituality, eco-spirituality, and spirituality and the arts. Her books include Desert Daughters, Desert Sons, Rethinking the Christian Desert Tradition, and the book that's on sale here and that you can find through the link, Eco-Spirituality, An Introduction. She enjoys rewilding her humanness while camping, especially the Oregon coast, and cultivating an urban eco-spiritual identity in the city of Portland. She is a longtime vegan, a knitter, a reader, a piano player, and a poetry writer. She was already reconnecting with Sister Eva, a fellow poetry writer extraordinaire in our front row here. Living in a time of ecological crisis, she finds hope in the new forms of life emerging to repair disconnection from and foster care for the sacred natural world. So please join me in extending a very warm St. Mary's College welcome to Dr. Rachel Wheeler.
Thank you. And as I begin, want to express my pleasure at being here and my thanks for the hospitality I've already enjoyed here at St. Mary's. It's really good to be here. So some of my work here in eco-spirituality draws from the work I do with students at the University of Portland. So I want to acknowledge them too. And if you read my book, you'll notice that I do mention them and engage their work with my own, because they really help me in terms of their questions, in terms of their concerns, their joys, all sorts of things that really help me in thinking through how to apply my work meaningfully. Right now, I'm interested in these three topics, which is why I organized my talk around them. Kinship ideas, rewilding, and ecotherapy. So this is a little bit of a supplement also to the Ecospirituality textbook. If you get that book, you might not see some of these issues explicitly focused on, but this is kind of where my work is alive right now. As I begin, I also want to express gratitude for the place where I do my work. So the land and labor acknowledgement of my own place in Oregon, Portland, Portland's in the Multnomah County, named for a tribe that still has members around, and of course a lot of other Native peoples in the Willamette and Columbia Gorge areas where I come from. Really important to the formation of that space and the preservation of a lot of the vitality that is in that space. So I just want to honor that too, and the labor of all the people over the last 150 or so years that have made a city and a university where I can do my work. So with that beginning, I also want to read this poem by Joy Harjo, our first Native American poet laureate here in the US. And this particular poem, Remember, is one that I think all these practices are about. They're really about trying to get us to remember something crucial about our human identity. So as I read this poem for us, maybe we can just think about how we might do this and how maybe we're already doing it in some ways. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth. How your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. Okay, so with us ringing in our minds, this invocation to remember, I hope you'll engage these practices and ideas with me. So the itinerary for my talk today is just to give us a little context, and I'm going to use the work of Joanna Macy, whom I'll introduce shortly, just to think about where has eco-spirituality kind of emerged from, or re-emerged, because it's really about reviving some values that have already been so important to a lot of peoples already. And then the content about the practices, thinking about kinship, rewilding, ecotherapy, focusing on some ideas about that, to think about the way we use our thoughts, the way we use our words, language, so our attitudes, and then also our behaviors, how that might intermingle with our thoughts and words. And then just an invitation again at the end that I'll conclude with. So our 21st century setting, this is a picture of Joanna Macy, really important thinker for me in giving us an idea around the worlds we inhabit now in the 21st century. She also is interesting for me because her background is Christianity. She majored in biblical literatures, was going to be a missionary, and then she also encountered some Buddhist tradition and felt like there was something there too, vital for her in the work that she wanted to do. But she was really drawn to the suffering that is a piece of Buddhist practice, right? And the recognition that life and change and all these things that we often resist produce suffering and what to do with that. And she thought there's something really wonderful about this too for engaging the world we inhabit today, especially with climate change, with nuclear war and all these kinds of things that she was going through in her earlier life. She's still alive and a very important teacher in her 90s, but I'm going to talk about the framework that she uses, drawn from this website, The Work That Reconnects. And if you want to do more thinking with this, a lot of these resources are available online. So she uses these 3 stories framework to say that there are 3 kind of concurrent stories happening, and we can choose where we put our energy behind some of these stories. And there's just some symbols up here to kind of think about what these are. I'll name them briefly and then just describe them for us. A business as usual model, that story, an unraveling story, and then a turning story. And again, the point is that these are all happening at the same time. And again, we have a choice around which energies we put our own life work toward. So business as usual, the first story is the story of the Industrial Growth Society and the European-based colonial empires from which this has emerged. It's the dominant enforcing mechanism of a predatory, capitalist, imperialist economic system. In other words, the corporate, financial, military, industrial complex. That's really wordy, but she says it a lot that way to say it's very complicated, all the ways these kind of systems interact. That perpetuates patriarchy and white supremacy for the profit and power of a few. So business as usual, that might sound familiar to a lot of us. And its assumptions are basically that economic growth is essential for prosperity, that nature is just a commodity to be used for human purposes, that promoting consumption is good for the economy, and its central plot is that we need to get ahead, and the problems of other peoples, nations, and even species are not our concern. So that's just a little summary, I think probably sounds pretty familiar to most of us. And then also I think the second story that's happening alongside this story is Great Unraveling. And Dan introduced me as a knitter. I kind of like this image because it's using knitting, right? The loops that are all connected in handiwork to say, oh, that's happening. We're pulling apart from that interconnected piece, an unraveling of the world. And this is a story that's told primarily by scientists, journalists, and activists who have not been bought off or intimidated by the forces of the industrial growth society. It draws attention to the disasters that are being caused by business as usual, and their accounts give evidence of the ongoing derangement and collapse of biological, ecological, economic, and social systems. So again, probably sounds kind of familiar to us. We probably hear a lot about these kinds of stories happening too. Economic decline, resource depletion, climate change, social division and war, and of course the mass extinction of species going on as a great unraveling. Another thing that's really interesting to add to this piece, this story that's happening, is new language that's emerging to describe experience of unraveling. And I've put a couple of these up here to just think with, if you've never seen some of these phrases, like pre-traumatic stress disorder. So assuming that there's trauma to come that's going to be worse than the trauma we're already experiencing, and that compounds and actually creates something that is happening ahead of time. And then nature deficit disorder, this idea that not enough children are spending time out in the woods. That book by Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, is documenting that there's something happening to children's formation if they're not spending that time, and it's something he can diagnose as nature deficit disorder, and that we need vitamin N to nature to actually function well as a human species. And this idea of species loneliness, too, is very evocative for our time, to think about that we don't have enough connection within the natural world with other species, with plants, with forests and rivers, and all these things that most of human history has been engaged with on a daily and even hourly basis. And our disconnection from that is yielding something that's pretty problematic and that we should pay attention to. So species loneliness is something that we might think of as this existential angst that humans may be experiencing and need to do something about. And then eco-anxiety, kind of emerging to name the concerns people feel about the changing climate that we all share, and what isn't being done about it. So that's a particular name being given to that fear. Climate grief, too. So the kind of interaction between fears and anxieties, but also grief and sadness and anger and all these kinds of things that are wrapped up together as something that we're experiencing in our everyday lives. And then this term solastalgia by Glenn Albrecht talks about the nostalgia people are beginning to feel for places that they're already at home in, but they see the degradation happening in their neighborhoods or locally, and they feel nostalgic for the way it used to be, and saying this is something that is also creating some sadness and concerns about what the future could look like as it's changing already. And then the last thing on my list here is psychic corpus dissonance, which I think is such a strange phrase, but interesting. It's drawn from the Bureau of Linguistical Reality. They host workshops for the creation of names and phrases for what people are going through now with climate change. What are they feeling? And this is one of my favorites from them. Just a phrase that the two founders of the Bureau put together to say, we we like climate change because sometimes we're outside in the late winter and it'll actually be warm and it feels nice to be outside when it's warm, but we know we shouldn't be enjoying this, so there's this psychic corpus dissonance happening. So I think some of us might feel that sometimes, this kind of knowledge that we shouldn't always be feeling what we're feeling. So anyway, I just brought that list to our awareness to just think about the range of feelings and emotions and experiences people are having today as they register that an unraveling is happening, and different people coming into the conversation too, not just people maybe responsible for our psychological health, but philosophers and theologians, I guess people like me, people across the board just saying we need to kind of get in on this conversation and at least say what we're experiencing so that we can talk with one another about what it is and then maybe provide some solutions or some ways of healing. So I think that's really interesting, the range of people involved in the conversations around naming the experience of unraveling. Okay, finally, we have business as usual, great unraveling, and then we have something optimistic or hope-filled, I think, the great turning. And she says this is happening too. So these are three concurrent stories, all happening at the same time. Again, a choice to put our energies around whichever one we can. The great turning is the story of transitioning from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. Attitudes then shift from exploitation to respect, from extraction to regeneration, from competition to cooperation. More and more people come to see how interwoven we are as peoples, and to recognize that solidarity with one another is a way through these crises. So we join together to act for the sake of life on Earth. The Great Turning. Okay, so in The Great Turning, she thinks about three different ways people might be showing up for this world, this story that's ongoing. And there's just an image there to kind of alert us to the different things that she hopes maybe everyone will be involved in different ways and to the different capacities that we have. But holding actions is one way to participate in this story, structural change down at the bottom of the image, and then also shifts in consciousness. And I'll just talk briefly about what each of these things are before I get to the practices that I want to talk about. So the first piece about holding actions, here we can see a demonstration, right? At Standing Rock, people showing up to say no, no to the pipeline that was proposed for that place in the US. And solidarity, right? A lot of other people going who wouldn't be necessarily affected by this, but just showing up to say no, holding actions to say, let's not let this happen, let's come up with another plan. We might not know what the plan is, but no to the proposal, right? So that's one way, just showing up to say no to things that are wrong. The second piece about shifting to alternatives, I just put some pictures there of things that are happening, at least in Portland, that I think are interesting in terms of community garden space. That's happening all over the place, of course, but people who don't have access to provide access for fresh foods. I think sharing economies are now becoming more and more out there. We have little libraries, but there's also, Free Cycle and things online that people are using a lot more to opt out of the economic structures that a lot of us are entrenched within. Tiny houses are kind of a thing in Portland too, which I think are interesting with experiments in downsizing and kind of saying no maybe to the expectations of what life in a house might look like. And then on the lower left, I put this new thing that I've been watching over the past year, this emergence of ecoversities, which are an interesting learning space that's not just the university, but learning that happens in alternative spaces and really from the grassroots and from people who have practical know-how about how to provide solutions, especially to sustainable problems. And I love this question from their website about what might the university look like if it were at the service of our diverse ecologies, cultures, economies, spiritualities, and life within our planetary home. I think that's a great question for a university, a great question for almost any industry or place. So I really am interested in how that's growing. And of course, the digital platform that it operates within provides a lot of webinars and trainings so that you can see what's happening in different parts of the world and whether it's applicable or not in the place you're in. It's a really interesting way that education is being rethought. A great alternative. And since I'm in an educational institution, I thought I would introduce that if you haven't heard of it before. Finally, shifts in consciousness, which is where ecospirituality kind of emerges, but it might have its tendrils elsewhere. There are some things in here that Joanna Macy talks about in terms of in the last 50 years, what has been coming into our general consciousness across different disciplines, general living systems theory and the sciences, deep ecology, and a new kind of sense of deep time and our ancestral, short ancestral footprint as a human species on the globe. Creation spirituality, eco-spirituality, eco-liberation theology, all these kind of evolutions of thought that are drawing on different streams in the tradition. Engaged Buddhism and similar trends in other greening of traditions. The resurgence of shamanic traditions and certainly indigenous resurgence too is adding to the shift in consciousness. And I think a lot of the practices that I'm drawing on kind of have their roots in that indigenous resurgence and important ideas that are coming from people who've been all along living some of these lifestyles of better relationship with the natural world. Ecofeminism and eco-psychology is also kind of a furthering of certain fields. And then the simple living movement or minimalism. All of these kinds of things are shifts in the way we think, attitudes, values, all these kinds of ways that can promote that story of the Great Turning and what it would look like. Okay, so in terms of eco-spirituality, I have a little definition if it's not something you've heard of before. It's just a compressed word, ecological spirituality, so a form of spirituality, right? And here's just a couple sentences that I think try to comprehensively state what eco-spirituality is. So it describes the experience of relationship with the sacred in the context of belonging within our earth and cosmic homes. And I'll just pause there and say the belongingness is really important. That word, eco, comes from the Greek for home, right? Home. So this sense that Earth is home, and we're a part of everything that's here. We're not just kind of transplanted from some other place. We're really homegrown from the ground itself. And the second Genesis story helps support that thing when God is seeming to shape the human from the ground, and this kind of linguistic link with the actual Earth that's so important, at least to biblical peoples, to support that identity of belonging. Secondly, the second sentence, eco-spirituality encompasses attitudes and practices that enliven our experience of ourselves as members of the Earth community and that activate our ability to live in a manner expressive of gratitude, respect, care, and joy. And I like the word, I wrote this, so I like it, but the verb in there, enliven, seems important, because this is already true. We are members of the Earth community, right? This is already kind of our default setting. We just aren't always living it in some way or aware of it and living from that reality. So I think eco-spirituality is really supposed to focus on that and bring it to the fore if it's something we've neglected or that we just haven't affirmed enough in our life or had affirmed in the communities we've been a part of. So that's what we're aiming for. That's kind of the big statement, I think, of what I'm trying to think with here. Further, it does draw a little bit from some things that Pope Francis has said in Laudato Si, his encyclical on creation care, now 8 years old. From paragraph 222, he has some things, I won't read the whole paragraph there, but some values and some things that might be consistent with this eco-spirituality. A prophetic, contemplative lifestyle, he says, is important. Deep enjoyment, being present to each moment, having the capacity to be happy with little, gratitude. All of those kinds of pieces could be part of what eco-spirituality is aiming to make possible. And this shift, too, in the lower right corner, you'll see that diagram, kind of this shift from egocentric thinking to ecocentric. It's also a part of his encyclical, right? To question our anthropocentrism, which is such a natural part of our being as a species, but doesn't have to be the only part. We have empathy, we have imagination, we have creativity, and all these ways that we can think beyond our human-centeredness. So that's also a part of what I'm thinking about in terms of eco-spirituality. And I think these three stories of Joanna Macy, the great turning, the great unraveling, business as usual, some of the proposals she has for thinking about how our commitment to the great turning could be lived out goes well with what Pope Francis is advocating in this encyclical, because he writes about ecological conversion, which you may have heard about, ecological conversion. And I think some of the questions that she poses with her work in terms of the turning away from, turning toward, all these kinds of things is about conversion, right? So where and how are you turning up? What are you turning away from, saying no to? What are you turning toward? All those questions that help you identify what your actions or what your contribution is to the great turning is consistent, I think, with living out an ecological conversion. So that seems really important. So there are a lot of key thinkers beyond the Catholic world, at least the Catholic world I inhabit, with Pope Francis and what he's doing, although very appreciative of everything that he's been lifting up. But I wanted to name a few people globally who also have been very important in bringing about the great turning in a lot of places where they're located. You may recognize some of these faces. Rigoberto Menchu, the Guatemalan indigenous activist on the upper left, and Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese proponent, really, of an engaged Buddhism on the lower left. Vandana Shiva in the middle, the scientist who advocates for food security and sanctuaries for seeds and is resisting GMOs. Wangari Maathai on the right bottom, the Kenyan founder of the Greenbelt movement. And then Satish Kumar on the upper right, who's a former Jain monk and has founded the Schumacher College in the UK. Each of these people from different traditions really showcase, I think for me, kind of the common experience of what's happening in the natural world and with the human species. So I think those representatives are really worth looking into if you want to know their stories and how they got involved with their particular activities. So thinking about the practices from there, the first set of things I want to think with is just radical kinship practices. And this word radical, of course, you probably know, comes from the root, right? So thinking about rootedness and thinking about the relationship of the human as a rooted species here in the natural world and how to live out more fully our belonging here and our belonging to a larger earth community than just its human members. Some of the thinking that I think is important comes from Enrique Salmon, who is also a thinker in ecology more, but I'm extending his work to kind of fit into this eco-spirituality model because he thinks about kin-centrism. So kin-centric ecology is really important for him to say that we think about relationships. We center relationships when we're thinking about ecology. Ecology is already about the study of relationships, right, in a scientific mode. But he wants to really emphasize that by using this word kin-centric. And of course, kin means family too, family relationships. So I think it's really interesting to help us think about, okay, we usually think about a tree, maybe a family tree, right? Putting together our relationships just in the human mode, and that's what the branches on this image kind of call out, the focus on the human that we usually perform when we think about family. And moving to this web of life language and thinking about the more expansive and comprehensive and complicated relationships we have, both outside ourselves with the natural world and parts of it, and inside too, right? So many microorganisms that make up our inner ecology is very interesting for us to think about and to consider as kin. And I really like what he proposes as well in thinking about these kin relationships as with species we know, species we cultivate familiarity with, because I often get entrenched a little bit in thinking about like the sacred is a part of wonder, right? Thomas Berry defines the sacred as that which evokes the depths of wonder. And I think that's a great definition. I think wonder is a great thing. I love feeling wonder-filled. But Enrique Salmon is a little critical of that thinking, to always be focused so much on the strange and unfamiliar, because he says we should foster familiarity with these things so they don't knock our socks off all the time. We just are so conversant and familiar with them, the way we are with our own family members, human family members, that we have that familiarity and that kinship. And so he's urging us to greater knowledge, really, of the habitats that we are a part of, or other animal species that are sharing life with us in the neighborhoods and the homes that we have. That's a part of what is the sacred as well, not just that which focuses on what creates awe for us. St. Francis, patron saint of ecology, you may have heard of his Canticle of Creations, which focuses also on kinship relationships, right? Calling different parts of creation names of sister and brother and all of this kind of thing, which is really wonderful as a sensibility that's already in kind of a part of the Catholic and Christian world. This image by Michael Devine is really special to me just because he's put halos around all these different parts of creation too, to say there's that sacredness to not just the human figure, St. Francis himself, but each relationship that he formed with these different parts of creation also are sacred. Sacred peoples. And of course the image too has this circularity to it in terms of its dimensions, so it almost makes the whole forest setting sacred with this halo that just saturates all the parts of the landscape, which I think is really an important piece of the cultivating of kinship. In the Christian tradition too, I just want to focus also on some examples that talk about kinship in terms of our experience. So the human and the plant world, the animal world, all these kinds of ways that we've helped ourselves understand ourselves by how we understand the rest of the natural world. The quote on the left here is from the desert tradition, the tradition I have studied the most, and it's one of my favorite sayings just because it's saying something about the resonance between human and plant life or earth life in the same way as how it starts, that no plant whatsoever grows up on a well-trodden highway, not even if you sow seed, because the surface is trodden down. So it is with us humans. Withdraw from all busyness into quietness, and you will see things growing that you did not know were in you, for you were walking on them. I really love that saying because it just reminds us that things are growing in our lives all the time. Seeds that we don't know are there unless we take time to pay attention, and it just resonates with the similarity to the earth that we really are. And then this little lyric, just a one stanza poem by John O'Donohue more recently, that says, "I would love to live like a river flows, carried by the surprise of its unfolding." Again, just a really beautiful statement about the similarity, about something else in creation beyond the human that helps us understand what's possible in our own lives. And of course, that's not limited to Christian tradition. There are other examples out there of how the natural world, because of the relationships most humans have had for it for most of history, has learned about themselves because of what they see happening in the rest of the natural world. So kinship and thinking about all my relations beyond the human, that the human is embedded within, is really, really key to cultivating this kinship. I'll do one more example from Catholicism, though. Teresa of Avila, thinking of prayer life as this flourishing garden. And she talked about different stages of the prayer life that could happen as one waters pretty laboriously with a bucket or with a well that you draw buckets from, or then digging canals where the water can flow naturally. So she's thinking about all these kind of mechanical ways to do prayer and the way that a garden could be grown by being watered. And then finally she aims at just being watered by rain, kind of the natural falling, spontaneous falling. All of that is kind of the gift of grace and the gift of what she is aiming for when God is fully present or acknowledged as fully present to her. So that's a really beautiful image for me to think about our lives and the movement past the mechanical engagement, but being open to what is natural. Finally, just thinking about kinship practices. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a contemporary writer that many of you probably are aware of, and she's written this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass 10 years ago now, from 2013. But she advocates from the indigenous worldview to say that our objectification of nature is part of the problem with our thinking. And so she has an article that just says, let's not use the word it for nature or natural beings anymore. And she uses a really beautiful familial image to advocate for this and say, you would never think about your grandmother in the kitchen, making soup for you over the stove. It is making soup. You just would never say that, right? So why do we say it about any part of the natural world? So she's trying to help us think beyond the human and just to recognize the value of so many different relationships that are out there, and I really honor that. So to conclude just this part of kinship, introducing you to some kinship practices, I think it might be worth thinking about regarding or even addressing other parts of creation with this second person pronoun. We could say you. We could use some of the words that she suggests, ki and kin, so ki in the singular and kin, because that's a useful word already in the English language, but she draws on indigenous languages to say this could be a way to refer to, give a pronoun to nature that allows us to think beyond the objectification that it might reinforce. From Enrique Salmon's suggestions, just becoming familiar, right, with our inhabitants of our home, neighborhood, and bioregion could be really important to recognize our kinship relationships. And then just this idea of stage continuity. And I like this image. I think it's a little artificial. I don't know if you've seen it kind of wandering around social media feeds, but it has in my circles with ecospirituality and ecotherapy, just to kind of point out the resemblance materially of the veins of the leaf and the human palm. I don't know if it's real or not, but it does suggest some commonality that would be interesting to look for. And I often talk with my students about the similarity between, our language of a tree. We talk about limbs, and we have limbs. We talk about trunk, and we have a trunk. All this kind of language of similarity we use to talk about nature and ourselves might be worth going out and just looking for that and thinking through the implications of some of that, and even putting our hand next to a tree that the color resembles or something, or even using other parts of our experience to connect with other parts of creation, even vocally, like singing or saying something and hearing a bird or hearing another animal respond. Just kind of making that connection with different parts of creation could be a really important way to reweave this connection that is already there, of course, but just kind of living it in a more fully realized way. So moving on to rewilding practices. Rewilding, you may know, is a conservation strategy to kind of let spaces take over and use their own wisdom to be what they're meant to be. Mark Beckhoff, the ethologist, has already kind of thought about how we might do that internally. So he tries to match this idea of outer ecologies, outer conservation strategies with inner ecologies and inner conservation strategies. And some of the ideas that he has are really interesting, just to think about rewilding human behavior and kind of creating this corridor between our brains and our hearts, which he thinks are usually not connected, and that they should be. So there are some things that we might do about making explicit connections between our head and our hearts. In terms of contemplative practice, empathy, being willing to feel whatever is in our hearts, even if it's grief, any of the things that kind of emerge around letting ourselves be the natural way we are and not so kind of put in a box and not feeling the things that are natural to us at this time. Victoria Lours has done some interesting work rewilding Christian religious communities in I don't know if you've heard of her work, but she's in Vancouver, so she's kind of in my Pacific Northwest world. Her book on the left here, Church of the Wild, is really interesting in terms of forming this wild church network where people are going outside and doing some connecting practices and using it as liturgy. So rewilding some of maybe the traditional Christian practices that people have been involved with in community life to just do outside and to say, part of rewilding is just living outdoors and doing the things that we always contain ourselves with indoors to do and just do them outside. So how could we do that in very simplistic ways with like church life? How could that look different? And of course, a lot of this emerged naturally for some spaces during COVID when it wasn't safe to be indoors. So that is an interesting mix with what she's trying to make possible with this network. And then this idea of forest bathing, too, which has emerged from Japan in the last part of the 2nd century. This could also be part of the ecotherapies, but in terms of rewilding and just thinking like a bath, forest bathing, we don't usually bathe outdoors, right? But this is something that if we do metaphorize to be something we do in the natural world, then it is something that helps us rewild and think about the naturalness of our doing life processes outside. And it depends on your comfort level, where you are with a lot of these practices. Sleeping outside, using the restroom outside in the woods. That takes some practice. Doing a lot of the things that we think about that are just indoor activities, right? Just transferring them outdoors can do a significant work in kind of rewilding our sensibilities. And then I also want to mention this Council of All Beings, which I write about in the textbook a little bit. This is a practice that Joanna Macy was contributing to, and thinking about how do we identify with other living beings and kind of bring their sensibilities to council. And how can we do that if we think about deep time, meaning that we do identify in some way, that we have some way of thinking with these other creatures about what their lives are like, and maybe how their lives have been impacted by human presence, and what gifts they also offer the human community. So when I've done this with students, it's really interesting to think about what animals they gravitate toward, which they want to kind of embody in some way, coming together and offering ideas about how their habitats have been destroyed often by human presence, but also the gifts that they offer from their animalness to human life. And that kind of reciprocity is really interesting, to acknowledge that there are some things and gifts that animal life and plant life have that we too can embody in some interesting way. So in terms of rewilding, I think there are a few key practices I would like to point out. Like, we might embrace our animality, whatever that looks like for us. And it might be playful, a lot of evidence of play among the animal world, even though humans have often argued that our uniqueness is that we have such a long childhood compared to other species. But that play piece is still present elsewhere, and the doing something that doesn't appear productive, right? That could be a piece of our rewilding too. And then living more of our life outdoors, cultivating a sense of belonging there. And of course, this can be done even in the city, which is difficult to do, maybe more difficult to do. But just thinking about ourselves as a different way, as part of the Earth community, as part of a species that has done most of its maturation as a species outdoors, and that re-inhabiting that in some significant way means going outside and rewilding. And then I'd like to propose also that we could rewild our senses and just think about how emergent every sense we have is with what else is out there. And the ecofeminist Susan Griffin offered a really poignant illustration of this in her book, A Chorus of Stones. She writes something about that philosophical question about whether if a tree falls in a forest, would anyone hear? You probably have heard that question. Well, some people have said, okay, there are others beyond the human community who might be there to hear it fall, so there's sound happening regardless of whether we register it. But she also expands that to say something like, if the universe were silent, would we have ears? If the universe were silent, would we have ears? So it's really interesting to just think about our change as a form, a living form, as responsive to every parts of the world. So rewilding our senses might be to appreciate the fact that because there's sound is why I have ears, and so I'm listening. And because there's something to see is why I have eyes, and I'm discerning it. Because there are things to touch and interact with is why I have these tactile abilities. And it's really a beautiful practice to do that. And to also be reciprocal about it and say, I see, I'm seeing. Everything out there is seeing me too, or discerning me in some way. They know I'm here in their different intelligences, right? And I'm hearing, and they're hearing and sensing in other ways, maybe beyond the way that I hear, but that kind of reciprocity too, to not always be about our centered perspective, looking out and listening and doing all this kind of stuff, but also being responded to by others in the natural world, I think is another way to weave in our human identity with what is happening elsewhere. Okay, transitioning now to ecotherapy practices. So ecotherapy, if you've never heard of this idea, is just an applied form of ecopsychology. So psychology has been greening over the last 30 or 40 years, and it often looks like just people doing therapy outdoors. So that relationship between client and psychologist is happening outside. But this has been taken over by a lot of different disciplines. So it's not just something that happens in that kind of clinical setting, and not just about that dialogical relationship that's formed between someone seeking healing. And I like to point out that one of the first persons to write about ecotherapy is Harold Kleinbell, and this was from the 1990s. This was a book published by Fortress Press. He was a pastoral psychologist, so his background was totally pastoral care and thinking about ministry and focusing on the ways that people in church settings need also this reconnecting work, remembering work from the alienation that they experience from the natural world, and a lot of social problems really stemming from that disconnection. So even though it's been kind of, I would say, alongside, there's a parallel trajectory along the secular world of psychology, kind of greening and applying some of these insights, there's also this significant Christian presence, which is so interesting to me. But there are two images there on this page just to give you some ideas of how people are just doing ecotherapy and calling what they're doing ecotherapy. And one is just by being outside and doing something for the natural world and also for oneself, right? So planting a garden, eating the fruits of the garden, doing it in community, teaching others how to do that, that is therapeutic. And there are a lot of documented sources to talk about the specific embodied practice and change that's happening when people are engaging in parts of some of these practices. So there's definitely this kind of quantitative and qualitative mix in terms of sharing results around these practices. And then on the left, this equine-assisted therapy has emerged too in an interesting way, which is significantly not about using an animal for one's therapy, but is about reciprocity. So some of the horses that are in this practice have also been traumatized or have been cast away because they're too old for doing something meaningful in the lives that they had elsewhere. And so they're healing too in some of these sanctuary places where these reciprocal relationships are forming around being with animals. And Kate Burns, again, another kind of Washington-based person, so I'm thinking about Pacific Northwest initiatives, but she works in a center and she really focuses on the agency the animals have in this relationship too, that they're asked to be in relationship with the people who come out. So there's this asking of permission, there's this seeking consent from the animals if they're ready, and if they're not ready, if they want to do something else, they're given this freedom, which I think is really a beautiful way for the animals to perform their own healing in relationship with increased trust of humans, especially when that's been severed. So Healing Ourselves, Healing the Earth is the subtitle to Harold Kleinbell's book. So I just put that there as this kind of reciprocal focus that he initiated, which has been really furthered by a lot of people working in this field that is really important. Another person that I want to mention is Phoenix Smith, who founded this Alliance for Ecotherapy and Social Justice. And she actually works in public health now, but the formation of this liberation ecotherapy is really interesting to me. And this is from her website, where she talks about these principles that are forming that she says needs to counter what might seem entitled or privileged access to the natural world, which is an open question for people engaging ecotherapy. So describing the Alliance's work, she says it's at the intersections of mental health, social justice, and environmentalism to bring positive transformation, equity, and healing for the earth, ourselves, and our communities. Our goal is to increase access to and knowledge about ecotherapy for everyone, for peace and justice. And then there are some things there that she privileges as ways that all ecotherapy should be happening, and then provides some programming to do that. So social justice and equity are really important, accessibility, response to loneliness and isolation, cultural humility, and public health connection. So I'm just going to name two more organizations too that seem important in the way they're providing opportunities for ecotherapy to work. And again, they're not all psychologists or anything like this. They're working across disciplines and across places. The other organization is Radical Joy for Hard Times. This is founded by Trebi Johnson, and it's about addressing the woundedness of certain places in the world, like clear cuts, like polluted rivers, a lot of that kind of thing. And she has some steps there that I don't have time necessarily to point to all of these things, but the point is really to acknowledge them. And I will read this little quote from the Rad Joy website, which says, "You can do this practice every day in small, simple ways. By singing to a river, giving thanks for the food you eat, placing a flower over the body of an animal that's died on the road, and pausing before a rundown, neglected place to discover how nature is trying so hard to survive." And that's really important, kind of this notion of not getting overwhelmed by all the woundedness that we maybe notice over time, but really promoting the possibility of joy and seeing beauty in those places and creating the beauty too. So this organization fosters an annual Earth Exchange event. So if you look into their work, it's something any community globally can do and is done globally, and people will find a wounded place in their community and come together and do something in that place to commemorate the woundedness and commemorate the resilience. And it's a really beautiful practice that is therapeutic, hopefully, for the space, but also therapeutic for the human community coming together to commemorate those spaces. And then this Good Grief Network I want to mention that's made by Laura Schmidt and her partners in putting this together. Again, just an organization to look up and especially to say and to signal the importance of dealing with climate grief and having a safe space to do that within. Again, very therapeutic and then aimed toward enabling a person to engage activism or advocacy on behalf of the natural world. So it's not just about one's personal healing, it's really about becoming able to develop capacity to hold the complicated feelings that we have around climate change right now. So in terms of some of these ideas from ecotherapy practices, I think just recognition of distance from nature as wounding. Not certainly everyone will think about that automatically, that maybe there is a species wound that we all carry, or even an individual wound if you've seen a childhood place destroyed, or you're just dislocation from a place that's really important to you. Just kind of recognition of that woundedness is really important. And then identifying places and ways of being that might be therapeutic for you as well is really important as a possibility for this ecotherapy. And then developing reciprocity, so not being in it for just the healing of yourself, but really developing this capacity to give back. And this is something that Linda Vizel, an ecotherapist, has developed, these levels 1 and level 2 ecotherapies, where the 1 could just be about one's own healing, and that's legitimate and important. But then as we move to a different kind of level 2, which I think is important for spiritual practice too, spiritual practice might be just for us at some point, us and God and our relationship, but then if we move into another space, it becomes more meaningful for the larger community, not just the human. So that reciprocity is really important. And then this idea of asking permission too, I think is really evocative, just to kind of wonder about the places you go to and inhabit and interact with. Do you have a sense that you're welcome there? And if not, why not? And could you change that? I think being attentive to that could be really, really powerful. Okay, so in conclusion, I just want to invite you, having introduced you to a little of the ideas, attitudes, and behaviors that might be possible in thinking about kinship, rewilding, and ecotherapy, to say that I hope you can experience for yourself this claim. This is my claim. Participating in creating the abundant futures we want affirms our identity as creature kin, fosters hope and healing, gives our lives purpose and meaning, and results in satisfaction and joy. And I hope you all will experience that for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. We have some time now for questions and comments. Again, a reminder to our viewers online, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your question or comment. But for those of us who are kin in person in this space, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wheeler. This was wonderful. I am so struck by the prominence of joy in your definition of eco-spirituality and in a lot of these practices. I would love for you to say more about this joy, particularly because I think some of our conceptions of joy might seem to be in tension with this grief and this anxiety that you've been talking about. So how do you see this, why is this joy important, and how does it fit with all this other kind of sadness that's also a part of this climate reality for a lot of people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably one I can't answer fully, but it seems like joy is such a deliberate choice when other people have used that to compare with happiness, right? And happiness kind of being potentially superficial and supplied by consumerism or some of the destructive addictions that we have. And joy seems to push past that association and to say that there is joy that can well up in our lives if we understand that our lives have meaning and purpose, even amidst the grief and the sadness and challenge that we experience today. And so kind of the animating maybe quality of, within the Christian tradition, God, Spirit being involved in the work we do and the capacity we hold to engage the grief and not look away from it, does allow for that joy. And so I feel like it is important to point it out and to say that that is connected with hope too, right? That is what can foster hope for people who feel hopeless. And there's reason to feel hopeless. So I don't want to discount when people do feel embedded within that, but joy somehow does feel like a possibility and a really important countercultural attitude to cultivate, even if it's kind of assumed at sometimes. I don't know. What do you think in terms of joy and its importance?
I really appreciate the distinction between what you're saying is a superficial kind of consumer pleasure-seeking happiness and this sort of deeper cultivated disposition of joy. I think that seems crucial to me. And I think you're right that the tradition has practices for cultivating this deeper satisfaction and joy.
When you were discussing the different types of ecotherapy practices, you were discussing that there were different levels.
Yeah.
Would you be able to go more into the different levels that there are and then different types of like reciprocal relationships with wounded places?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question that I only engaged really superficially, but I really like the distinction that some people are making in eco-psychology and ecotherapy kind of applied settings where they're saying it's okay if it's good for your well-being to go on a little forest therapy walk. So go into the forest the way I did on Sunday with some of my students, led by a certified forest therapy guide. So we went into our forest in Portland and we spent some time and it felt really good. I think all our cortisol levels went down and everything, and so we left the woods and were really happy. So we felt better. But that's a level 1 ecotherapy where it just kind of does something for us. Level 2 is saying, well, maybe if I went back to the park and like cleaned up some litter, or maybe if I went back to the park or participated in some restoration of some habitat there or something for the animals or the birds, or did something that wasn't just for me, that would be a level 2 ecotherapy. And so, so again, they're not one better than the other, although I think level 2 might be better than level 1, but they're both using those numbers just to distinguish between what's happening when people are doing any kind of ecotherapy. Is it just for you? Are you the only one getting the benefit? Or is there some kind of reciprocity that you're giving back in some meaningful way? Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
So we have a question that comes to us from one of our viewers online. And they ask, in what ways have you noticed the gendering or lack thereof of eco-spirituality?
The gendering or lack thereof? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I want to answer, and I think this is right, that a lot of people engaged in eco-spirituality and furthering this field are identifying as women, and I think that might come from kind of this care stuff that's part of the theological tradition, maybe if it's coming from Christianity, that most women have been aware of and identifying maybe with nature more readily than men often have. So there can be a sense in which women are more active in some places in eco-spirituality, and that's true for the environmental movement too, that as far as I've read, where people are critical that the big spokespeople like Bill McKibben or some of these people who have a higher profile in terms of eco-action are great, but they're supported by a lot of women who don't get the limelight. So there are a lot of women who maybe gravitate to this field, anything related to the natural world, because of kind of this history that ecofeminists have pointed out, that the exploitation, all of that kind of stuff that's directed toward the natural world has been the same attitude that has disallowed women to be productive and happy and all those kinds of things. So I think there is a predominance, but of course I want to say Pope Francis is very vocal in the Catholic Church around the tradition of needing to care for the environment, and he calls on a lot of his predecessors, right, who have been doing this work too. So it's not primarily that way, but there is behind it, maybe behind the caretaking or the kind of response to wanting to renew relationship, I think some of the history of that ecofeminists have brought to light about the common plight between nature and women, and women's more readily gravitating toward this work because of that common lot. Maybe that is a way to just begin to address that question.
So we have 3 people in the queue already, and that may be as much as we have, but I just want to say that there will be people who are present with us who can talk to Dr. Wheeler afterwards. So if you have comments and questions, hang on to them. She's going to be here still. Yep. But you're up.
Oh, hi. I've just one last quick question. But you said that the COVID pandemic was just kind of getting everybody outside the house, and clearly you've been working with eco-spirituality for a while, but did you see like an increase in more people kind of working and cultivating that kinship with the outdoors during or after the pandemic?
I did, personally, and I don't know if that's true for other people, but I definitely had colleagues, in the institutional, educational setting who said they spent more time outside during COVID, and they got together with people in safe spaces outside, so they were cultivating kind of their human relationships in the outside setting. So it's not quite a relationship with the natural world, but it's getting there. It's kind of changing the setting where relationships can be fostered, and and I think people spending more time alone, too, during COVID has also made an awareness of presence beyond the human more available to them, to think of how am I companioned by my pet dog or my cat or these other species that are a part of our lives all the time, maybe, but we're paying closer attention to the needs we have for companionship and how they might have been supplied by non-humans during that time of COVID. So yeah, just anecdotally, I did find that from just people I've been in conversation with. I don't know if that's true for other people, but it rings true.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a really compelling talk in a lot of ways. I wanted first to just speak to this question of joy and grief. I think on one hand, it made me think of our own mortality and how the finitude of our life actually helps bring meaning to it, and that we have this tension as well between abundance and finitude. And so thank you for bringing that tension out. And to another potential tension, I was hoping you could elaborate on when you were talking about Enrique Salmon and this idea of wonder and the sacred evoking the depths of wonder, and familiarity or knowledge kind of being the other side of that. And I wonder what you think about ideas where more knowledge actually generates more wonder, right? As you get to know someone or some place more, you actually have more opportunities for wonder and more instances of awe. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
No, I love the way you put that. And I feel like I didn't mean to set up a binary. It feels like they're together, right? Both of them. And I also feel like, I think he would be recognizing this as well. Like even our closest family members, we don't know fully. They can surprise us, right? So there's this kind of nuancing of what we mean by familiarity and by wonder or surprise. But I love that idea that the more you know, the more you can be wondering at it. That's great.
I'm really inspired by what you said. I love the whole idea of eco-spirituality and the inherent sacredness of creation. But I am part of a Catholic church that has to bless everything before we use it, especially liturgically. So we have to bless water to make it holy. We have to bless bread and wine to make that holy. We have to bless our meals to make them holy. And that mindset is so anti everything you're saying. So I just wonder if you have any idea about how we can break out of the patriarchal mold that all of us are in, some of us more consciously than others, but it affects all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good observation. And I guess my first response is just to think about those blessing practices as a recognition of what already is, and to say, okay, if we still live within that framework, maybe we need to give more attention to that's what's happening. It's not a making, and I know that's maybe heretical to some folks, if transubstantiation is a piece of that. But yeah, the recognition and the recognition of what is in that blessing moment could be part of it. But I also wonder about just, making everyday things more sacred too, in the way we interact with them. And I know that's very Benedictine, right? Treat everything like the vessels of the altar, that kind of thing. So kind of making the sacred go into the ordinary and mundane. And just thinking about other places and other traditions that maybe are offering access to the sacred in different, more wide open ways. So to counterbalance that. It's a really good observation.
The enthusiasm for those gathered here to speak and to ask questions, I hope carries over to the informal conversation, but we have to bring our formal presence to an end. Please join me in thanking Dr. Wheeler for this extraordinary lecture. Two reminders. One, we have the bookstore right here, so go talk to Dr. Wheeler near the bookstore. And the second reminder is this conversation continues here at St. Mary's College, most notably with our panel discussion on October 3rd in Carroll Auditorium at 5 o'clock. We will have faculty members, our sustainable farmer, and a student in conversation about eco-spirituality or their relationship to ecology as a way to end both this season of creation that we're in right now, again, an ecumenical shout out, something Pope Francis has emphasized greatly, but also to celebrate Farm Week here at St. Mary's. So please do join us. It will be live streamed as well for our friends online. We hope to see you there in person or virtually. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.